afternoon, and welcome to Saturday Sesh. My name is Trey Reckling with the Academy of Cannabis Science, and we are so happy to welcome you. This is something we do the first Saturday of every month at noon Pacific, and if you're just joining us for the first time, we hope it's not going to be the last. These live on YouTube after the fact, so we've got dozens and dozens of hours of free educational material that you can join us and enjoy after the fact there. We are very happy and delighted today to be joined by Russ Hudson, the author of the Big Book of Terps. Russ is a cannabis phytochemical researcher. He's a compliance and regulatory affairs expert and an international cannabis consultant, just coming off of a trip. And this is our first time meeting Russ as well. So, Russ, welcome to Saturday Sesh.
Cool. Thanks, Trey. Thanks for having me. And also, I want to thank everybody here attending right now. I'm pretty sure I know all of you, either directly or indirectly through social media and cannabis industry work. So I appreciate everyone's support and camaraderie and good work in the industry.
Thank you very much. So, I gave you just a thumbnail bio of you. Could you tell us a little bit about you beyond that and help us to know you a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So cannabis has been my entire life, almost all of my career. This is my 32nd or 33rd year working with cannabis, starting in the late 80s and early 90s, selling nickel and dime bags. I was a street kid. I was an orphan, and so I did what I had to do to survive. And cannabis early on became part of that and made me successful, at least in surviving. On the streets, I was able to eat. I was able to not die and be in nasty situations for the most part. So it has been my life's work, starting there and then working my way up the black market ladder. I did a lot of brokering between states, and then for a long time doing brokering between Mexico and the United States. And I was also doing the transporting myself. I've been to jail repeatedly for cannabis in several different states for cultivation and trafficking. I've done guerrilla grows, closet grows, large scale outdoor, indoor. Eventually, the brokering work that I did led me to do more brokering at a much larger scale. And of course, this was all in the black market in those days. And moved to Europe. I worked with the coffee shops of the Netherlands and the suppliers networks there. Then worked in Belgium doing some early work with the social clubs that did exist for a few years there. Germany, was a German resident there, trying to get involved in the industry there around 2011 or 12, but it was very difficult at that time. And then I moved to Spain and spent about 7 years working with the private cannabis social clubs there. And that's where I really cut my teeth sort of in the more regulatory compliance and applications and licensing consulting work, and helped hundreds of private cannabis social clubs and tens of thousands of people who were in Spain and needed safe connections. Eventually, that work led me to develop the concept for the Big Book of Terps and develop the research protocol that we need to undergo to make that happen. And I returned to the United States finally and started working on that a couple of years before COVID hit. So I wasn't really much in the public life at that time, although I had been a lot in Europe. I sort of stepped back a little bit from the cannabis space to focus on the Big Book of Terps and the research and writing and editing that required. And that was finally just finished this past year. So now I am actually back into a lot more of consulting work and licensing, regulatory compliance, but trying to hopefully one day make the shift fully to just talking about molecules and just doing that kind of research.
Fantastic. What a journey. So, help us understand that transition, that deep dive into academia, like to do this research, because what most people know about terps would probably fit on 2 pages. And I'll bet you, do you have a book handy there? A copy of,
Yeah.
Show us. I mean, we're talking about a big book of terps. It's no lie. And so if you imagine what most people know about terpenes, um, we would only carry us through just a few pages. So where did you start and how did you take this mass of information and kind of missing information and start to build that?
One of the things I noticed early when I was moving Mexican cannabis to the Northeast was that you could smoke just shitty Mexican weed and get high from it, but after a short amount of time, it didn't really work for me anymore. And then during the years in the early 90s, we would get a lot of really fine cannabis, BC bud down from Canada. And that stuff was like $90 an eighth, absolutely preposterous pricing. And when you smoked it, it'd blow your mind. It was amazing. But also, after a short amount of time of using that cannabis, it didn't really work for me anymore. So I go to my drawer and I pull out my shitty Mexican weed and I'd start smoking that again, and I would get really high. So I knew in my teen years that there was something about the chemical composition of cannabis that didn't make sense, that couldn't just be attributed to THC, because I did know for sure that the THC in that Mexican product was very low. We adulterated the hell out of it. We treated it badly. It came in massively compressed bricks that often were molded and just, not great product. So I know the THC was significantly degraded and was probably realistically at like 7, 8, or 9%. The BC bud coming down from Canada at that time had to be in the 20s in those years for sure. So that's where I started kind of scratching my head saying something doesn't really work here. And then as I got older and more experienced in the cannabis industry, that just really solidified for me more and more with my personal experience, with other people's experience. And eventually you started hearing whispers of terpenes. Once I started looking at terpenes and reading, what Ethan Russo and Raphael Michelin had to say about the entourage effect, a light bulb came on, and I was like, "That's it. This is the path that I want to go down." Because, especially in my work in Spain, I worked with a lot of cannabis social clubs that mislabeled cannabis. I saw heavy adulterating of strains. Realized very quickly that there's no such thing as a strain. Honestly, there are only chemical content, and I think we need to refer to that. That's the direction that I hope to take this. But Spain and my work in Europe taught me that we were not being scientific at all. We were abusing the product that we were selling to people and the information that we were giving to them. And at that time, I said, okay, I'm tired of the hyperbole. I'm tired of the myths about cannabis. I'm tired of us presenting ourselves as a medical community without the basis in the background in chemistry, organic chemistry, or anything to really start from. And I felt like a lot of the work that I did in Spain was very, very sick people would contact me. In fact, even up in Sweden, in the north of Europe, there were doctors that when cancer patients had their all, meaning they'd had all the treatment regimens and the doctors had nothing left to try, they'd say, go see this guy in Barcelona, he'll take care of you. So we would set them up in an apartment. We would teach them how to make RSO. And the difficulties in doing that and the difficulties in explaining the mechanisms behind why it worked made it impossible for me to feel comfortable. And I really needed to come from a position of science that I could explain what that looked like. And it was around that time that I said, okay, I think I'm going to take a step back from the consulting work, from working with the cannabis clubs, and find out what is in cannabis, so that when you as a person go to a dispensary, you know what you need for you as an individual, right? And you don't care whether it says Blue Dream or Northern Lights or whatever, because mostly that's all bullshit. What we need to know is, like, for myself, what I need as a chemical composition, and I need to be able to find that. And I started this book to basically begin that process.
Great. And as we know, as we get more information, our understanding and our language changes, and the way we refer to the plant changes. So, not too long ago, we didn't have lab data, right? So somebody would look at a plant and say, oh, it's a short plant with fat leaves, that's an indica. And, the tall, stretchy plant, that's sativa. And each of these things are going to give you these things. And we know that's not a lot of information, right? It's what we had to work on, and then or whether it's mids or it's fire. Well, what does that really tell you? So
Right.
we've evolved a great deal just over the last few years.
Yeah.
What's something that what are a couple things you've learned as you've researched and written this book that you had no idea, and probably a lot of things, but what might be a couple things that we might be interested to know that you were surprised to find out?
I mean, the first thing that blew me away was that after about 18 months of research, I had done maybe 1,500 studies by that point. I realized that um, you don't need cannabis to have this discussion. If we're talking about terpenes, you don't need cannabis. I almost was going to write myself out of a job because all the studies that I was talking about were not related to cannabis. We don't really have them yet. And as you said, in the last few years, we've learned a lot. There are now some studies, but at that time there just wasn't. I was constantly referring to other plants, and so I realized that um, terpenes are everywhere. In this room that I'm standing, they're in the paint on the walls. They're in likely the clothing, little snacks that we have in here. There's a couple plants in here. There's terpenes there. There's terpenes in the air. And the more I realized how prevalent terpenes were, combined with the fact that their medical and therapeutic value is well known. They're well studied compounds for a long time. And the fact that those two things were true, that they're everywhere and in everything, and they have such well documented medical value, but we are really just having this discussion. That was something that really kind of floored me and almost made me go on a different path, because it was really difficult to bring 580 pages of textbook back to cannabis consistently, because we don't have that information yet. So I think, there was a lot that I learned in the beginning, but the most important thing was that you don't need cannabis if you want terpenes.
And back to your point about entourage effect, you can do a lot with individual components, but the collective, in this case with terpenes and cannabinoids, you have a different operating system, of course, to, to affect our state. Could
Right.
you talk to us a little bit? We're talking chemicals, we're talking compounds. Some people would say, well, is a molecule a molecule? We've got cannabis-derived terpenes, we've got produce and plant-derived terpenes. Isn't a molecule when it comes down to it?
That is absolutely correct. I have this discussion almost every day. I wish that we could put this to bed as soon as possible, because, and I don't think that will happen. What's happening now is there are companies who have interest in profiting from science or actual terpene products, who they're not providing the correct information to consumers. So we're actually sort of sliding a little bit in the information that we're looking for. And I'm sorry, Trey, can you give me your exact question one more time?
Yeah, so yeah, I just wanted to firm up that because when it comes down to a molecular level,
Right. Okay,
the
we're on that.
molecule is the
Gotcha.
molecule, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So the difference in cannabis-derived terpenes and terpenes from any other source is zero. And I feel like that is being deliberately skewed among some players in the cannabis industry, because there are factions that are trying to sell cannabis-derived terpenes. They appeal to a mass audience of people who would like that idea, right? But first of all, they're mostly talking about adding terpenes back. So the discussion has to begin at, well, why are we removing these chemical constituents from this product in the first place, and then we're adding it back in? But you want to act like, because we've got the terpenes that we're adding back in from cannabis in general, that that's somehow good. And it may be, depending on the product formulation, but it's sort of irrelevant to the argument, because scientifically speaking, a molecule is a molecule. There's no such thing as cannabis-derived terpenes. Terpenes are terpenes. A molecule is a molecule. Alpha pinene is alpha pinene all day long. It doesn't matter what you do to it or where it came from. This is something that I think we need to discuss more. We need to defeat that idea of cannabis terpenes, because it doesn't exist, with the exception of cannabinoids. And this is another discussion that I always try to steer things toward, is that cannabinoids are also terpenes. Cannabinoids are terpenophenolic compounds, and a number of them are actually terpenes. They're just, they're built up terpenes, but they are still terpenes nonetheless.
And so, although a terpene is a terpene, we also know our ability and our knowledge to mix them in the same way that the plant mixes them is very, very limited, right? So if anybody's
Maybe
ever bought a
impossible.
product and said, "Oh, well, this is White Widow profile," it might be similar, but anybody who's consumed the original cultivar or whatever that might be probably recognizes it's close, but kind of like a Jolly Rancher is close, or a good candy is close to the flavor of the fruit it's pretending to be,
It
right?
should be, but the problem with this is we can't even get past this part of the discussion because a Jolly Rancher is a very specific formulation that is repeatable over and over and over again a million times. When we talk about White Widow, what is White Widow? What is Blue Dream? There's no such thing. When people talk about stabilized strains, even that, yes, you might have taken a phenotype and you're consistently growing that. That does not mean it's a stabilized strain. And the best example that I have of this is, let's say you're growing White Widow from the exact same genetics. You're growing, I don't care, in a greenhouse, outside, whatever. During your grow, part of your crop gets attacked by aphids. That's likely going to cause the plant to increase its amount of farnesene, which farnesene isn't often found in cannabis anyway. And if it appeared as a top, 3 constituent, that would be a kind of unique strain. If you test the other side of that same exact crop with the same exact genetics that did not get targeted by aphids, it's not going to have that farnesene production. So yes, you have a crop of White Widow, or do you? You don't. Because if you test that batch and you test this batch from the same exact grow, you will have two totally different phytochemical profiles. So I have made the argument pretty consistently now, there is no such thing as White Widow, Blue Dream, and there never will be. The repeatability of a phytochemical profile with a plant that you grow with water and soil and light, and you depend on no microbes, no viruses, no insect attacks, it's an impossibility. So this is why we need to stop talking about strains, first of all, call them chemovars, and understand that when we go looking for cannabis products, we need to stop looking for those names. We need to say, what are the top 3 constituents? Apart from THC, CBD, CBG, whatever, what are the top 3 terpene constituents? Because that tells us the most amount of information in a short amount of space about a particular variety. And it allows us to make a laser decision about, is that the right one for me? For instance, I would prefer a strain that's in this order: beta caryophyllene, limonene, and terpinolene. You would probably say go for a haze, right? Super lemon haze. Terpinolene is kind of the defining characteristic of a haze. But just because limonene is sold as limonene does not mean that it has terpinolene in it. It also doesn't mean that it has the right limonene. You could have limonene D, you could have limonene L, you could have linalool has the same thing, a couple of different isomers, and they're very different in that profile. So this is an important discussion, I think, to have, that there really isn't such a thing as a stabilized strain. You might have a good phenotype that you've been good at growing for a while, but I assure you that if you test it at different stages of the process, different stages of the grow, different stages of the harvest, at 30 days cure, 90 days cure, 120 days cure, all of those phytochemical profiles are going to be different. So how do you have White Widow? You don't. You
And
have
the
chemicals.
variability, I guess it shouldn't surprise us because in nature, the variability of offspring from two parents, ask anybody who's got several children, those children are not all the same, right? And
Right.
if even separated at birth, some go to live here and some go to live here, um, you have different, not products, but you have different offspring after time that are affected by their environment, that are affected by different things. And so um, it's a very cool way to reconsider the plant. And as we continue to want to do that, to want to reconsider their plant, I think the point you make is really good. If we're not talking terpenes as we're doing our shopping, if our bud tenders and consultants are not informed enough to be talking to consumers about terpenes, they might not ever learn it, because the average person is not seeking out a research paper about the efficacy of particular terpene profiles, right?
Right.
Um, so it's on us. It's on all of us who are willing to be kind of nerdy about this and really be interested to share that interest and hold up our lab scientists, because our lab scientists are showing us this plant in a way that we've never been able to understand it before.
Yeah.
So we know there are aftermarket products too, like in smoke shops and things like that. And you can buy little liquid drops to put in your bowl or to put on your joints to spice them up to that are supposed to be a, a particular cultivar profile. What we know that terpenes are strong elements, though. What
Mm.
words of caution would you have for people who might try to sauce their product up in that sort of way?
I mean, the primary word of caution that I have for the whole industry right now, from the producers to the consumers, is why is it assumed that terpenes are always good? Why is it assumed that synergistic effects benefit people? There are it's subjective. And it does drive me a little bit nuts that the cannabis industry is sort of pushing terpenes and synergy and all these related matters as beneficial. That's not always the case. It depends on who you are, what you're trying to treat. For instance, one of the things that I learned while researching the book is that oxidized linalool is a big problem for a lot of people and causes allergies. Those allergies have persistently plagued those people throughout their life, and they could not figure out why, because patch tests didn't include linalool. Linalool is in a shocking number of consumer products, from your shampoo to body washes, just all kinds of stuff. And when it oxidizes, it becomes an allergen. In Europe, they are testing, they're doing some patch testing for linalool now. But I think that I haven't personally known people who struggled with allergies and they thought, I don't know, it's eczema, it's dermatitis, it's psoriasis, I can't get control over it. I've tried every single treatment possible. And it could very well be that they were being sort of poisoned by their shampoo all these years. And so if we just look at linalool as an example, which is a top 10 terpene in cannabis, so it is important, there absolutely are considerations there. People need to know what terpenes are good for them. That's again why I say I don't care what strain you tell me. I need to know the constituents, because if I have an allergy to oxidized linalool and I'm oxidizing linalool by burning or vaporizing products that have it, I could be doing myself a disservice. If I have that allergy on a skin level, but now I'm consuming it into my body, warning flags for me are being, raised in that. And also, how do you know which terpenes affect you, right? We don't really know that right now because we don't have the science. So that's one of my hopes, is to help people understand, like, there are things that you need to look at to make these decisions. But also, for the manufacturer standpoint, yes, they spray terpenes on cannabis products now. I think that's honestly ridiculous. Why? Why are we doing that? It doesn't exactly work like that. If you read the introduction, or excuse me, the foreword that was written by Mitch Earlywine in my book, he went around with pure terpenes in vape pens and did blind tests on the street with people. And it was mercy. So you can imagine that people felt the effect of mercy, right? They should. It's a powerful sedative. Ethan Russo has said many times, when people talk about the sedative effects of CBD, incorrect. It's mercy. So in that particular case, if your edible is sprayed with myrcene and you're already a person who struggles with energy levels, how is that good for you? So I think, again, it all boils down to we need testing. And honestly, in many of my circles, I've been well hated for advocating so strongly for testing, because I come from the legacy market. Many of my people come from the legacy market, and they're like, fuck you, I'm not testing anything. It's weed, just smoke it, right? I appreciate that. I totally get it. But to have this discussion, to posit the whole medical angle, how can we get there unless we are talking about things on a molecular level? You can't just be spraying stuff on. Consumers are being duped into thinking that it's always good when you add terpenes. People and growers who say, oh, this is loaded with terps, or it's 3% terps, they're setting this vernacular that doesn't mean anything. And they're fooling people into thinking that as long as you say those things, or the bud tender says those things about those products, that it must be therapeutic, and that is dangerously wrong.
And Man, so much here to unpack. Love that you brought up allergies. Some people will just say I'm allergic to cannabis and cut it out of their diet, which we know it's a deeper dive required there.
Correct.
Um, we know that millions of dollars or a lot of money is being spent on products, liquid petrochemical products that are supposed to boost terp production, and people eat them up or buy them off the shelf quickly. And
Mhm.
so that's a lot to unpack. But I do want to come back to some of that and ask for questions from our people on board right now. I know Eric has a question. It says, Russ, what are your thoughts on the DNA testing for terpenes like Endocanna Health or MyStrain? And we know this is beginning to be a conversation about people doing a DNA test and then trying to line up that with your
With your end product.
profile product for you sort of thing.
I mean, this isn't really new, right? Like, yes, we can get a DNA profile. And what that tells us is this is the potential that this particular chemovar of cannabis has. Are you going to get that potential out of it? Maybe, if you did everything perfectly and had no abiotic or environmental stressors, no insects, you used all the right nutrients, and you did everything right all the time. But that's not going to happen. So all the DNA testing tells us is the potential that is there. Whether you grow in soil, whether you grow hydro, what nutrients you use, what kind of wind fatigue the plants stand up to, all of that is going to change that potential. So while I do think that it's interesting, and I do think it's a way to start the conversation about this is White Widow, and then the end products would be derivations thereof. They're not going to mimic that DNA profile, but I do think it is a good way to start that conversation. But in the end, it's not what matters. It's the chemical composition of that particular product that you're talking about. And again, as I mentioned earlier, even from one crop to another, the composition could be totally different. So we also have to have a discussion of at what level are we batch testing? And I think ultimately what we need is a quick method of being able to test end products, right? Outside of the laboratory setting. We need to get that technology built and we need to put it in the hands of dispensaries so that they could quickly say, this is what this product is, even though the potential, according to DNA testing, says it could be this.
Which goes to information and language. So Matt asked a question, how do you picture this in retail space as terms of not using strains? Because so much of our conversation in the retail space is about cultivar, right? Or it's about, at least we've evolved some, and it's not always about THC concentration, right?
Right.
Or THC percentage, which it still is in a lot of shops. And we hope we're evolving out of that as we get for more information. But it brings us back to language. So in evolving our language, how do you coach people up on having these conversations, talking about terpenes instead of the way we're used to talking about cannabis?
I mean, honestly, this was one of my major hopes of this book is I'm not so much interested in selling it in bookstores and retail outlets and stuff like that. I want this book to be on the counter at the sales point so that bud tenders and consultants can start having scientifically based conversations with people. And they can say, what do you want? You want to know about terpinolene? Let's talk about it right now, right here. These books should be well worn on the counter of dispensaries for the public. Dispensaries should buy them and basically gift them to the public and leave them on the counters so that you can arm yourself with information ahead of getting the actual technology. I have audited many dispensaries, and I'm never happy with what I hear bud tenders saying. It's the same old tired shtick of sativa, indica, couch lock, uplifting, energizing, and I don't know how to overcome that except taking the conversation to this level. And that's one of my primary goals here is to educate the consumer. I did come up with a sort of naming convention that I think would work, which primarily needs to identify the top terpene, top cannabinoid percentages, particularly THC, because that is an important metric. High amounts of THC without the right modulators make people feel like shit. We have tons of studies that say this. So one idea that I have is to make, you can call it whatever you want, right? So the bottle could say White Widow, but then it tells you the specifics. So it would say 25 THC, 2.5 LM, which would be limonene, 1.7 BC, which would be beta caryophyllene, and then whatever the third one would be. So those numbers would be percentages and the number that represents the terpene. Because from what I've seen, the top 3 terpene constituents are the most important. After the number 3, the concentrations drop so significantly that it's pretty difficult to imagine that they're significantly contributing to any type of therapeutic effects. So I think it would be okay to do that because that fits with this DNA testing, right? You could say this bottle of weed is derived from White Widow, which has this DNA profile, but here is the label of how it actually turned out based on our growing and processing methods and curing and packaging and all that.
Very good. And it's a lot, right? It's a lot for the casual user. One of the ways we encourage people is say, the next time you come across, in the case of flower, the next time you come across a grower, a cultivar that you really like, that works for you, it gets you in the zone that you want, turn the label around and find what that terpene profile is, and then search that terpene profile.
Correct.
They're like Phylos Bioscience or others, so you can get in the family, so you can say, hey, this Hindu Kush really makes me feel like, or it takes away my pain, it puts me where I'm trying to be in these situations. We'll find out, what's the lineage from Hindu Kush, because that might give you a family. And I know Leafly is doing this, or has started to do this recently, where instead of just indica sativa hybrid models that they used to show, they have like a little starflake or a little snowflake looking creature that's a representation based on terpenes, based on cannabinoid. And so there are ways to do that. But I think we have to start from what we know and then build out from there, because we don't, the DNA testing won't tell us enough right now. It's not going to point us necessarily to a cultivar. And like you said, even then, it might not put us, that information might not put us in the ballpark.
Right.
Let me ask, who else has a question online? I want to make sure we've got some inquisitive folks, and I know they've got questions.
I just want to say thank you, Russ, because for somebody who has the need to fight cancer off, this is so much more important than whenever I wasn't having the need to fight cancer off. Specifically because they've created all of these vapes, and these chemicals can get so concentrated, and then once you get cancer, you have that whole shock, and you don't have the money to go to the lab, you don't have the wherewithal to figure out the milligrams. So this is just, it is important. It's even more important than everybody realizes, in that we've got such an awesome plant for medical purposes, and it is important to figure out what works and doesn't work and going in the direction of what works. I love this about putting the terpenes on. I'm just looking at a label, and this particular label does have a few categories, like the 3 it has the mycinine is the ingredient, and then the so I think that it's happening. I think that we're learning, and it is going in that direction. And so and I agree, the big book on the shelf, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. This is just the beginning, for sure.
Thanks, Wendy. What else, you all? Because y'all know me, I got more questions.
So yeah, I just want to say thanks to Russ, and then I'm going to buy the book soon from Amazon.
Cool.
My question to Russ is like, see, I know I am a beneficiary of CBD, and then I've used it for 5-6 years now. I reversed my type 2 diabetes actually. So when I get into this palliative care for cancer patients, and I know I need to read a lot of what I listen from Russ. So Russ, is it only that we use cannabis for this palliative care, or as you said, we can use any other material to get the terps that will be useful for the cancer patients, especially patients who are in the third stage or fourth stage, which can reduce their pain. Will other than cannabis plants do this for the patients? That's the question.
I mean, it really depends on what type of cancer you're talking about. There are some amazing studies that were actually done in India that talked about this plant called fenugreek, right? Do you know that plant, fenugreek?
Yes, I know. I use it in my cooking every day. Yeah.
Okay, so this plant has a phytochemical profile that has been shown to be very good at defeating brain cancer. Remarkably so. And I don't know this plant. I'm not sure. I mean, it's not something that I've seen in the United States, but it really depends on what type of cancer you're trying to treat, and then what plant you have available to you, right? So if you are specializing in a particular type of cancer, I think that would be an easier direction to go and would achieve results faster than trying to attack it from a holistic standpoint, because so many terpenes, and particularly the flavonoids, are cancer killers. It's insane. I could not believe all the studies that I read that showed how powerful these compounds are against all different kinds of cancer. But we're talking hundreds of different terpene compounds. The ones I studied were numbering about 100, right? And then I narrowed it down to the 52 that I included in the book. Very powerful anti-cancer agents, anti-tumor agents, I forget what it's called, angiogenesis, which is when a cancer tumor builds blood vessels to keep itself alive. There are terpenes that stop that particular process from happening. So I believe that specialization of a multitude of people is going to be the correct path, because it's too much. There's too many types of cancer. They operate in different ways. They have different mechanisms. They're defeated in different ways, and the different phytochemicals work in different ways. And then you get into the discussion of synergy. So one of the things that I refer to often in the book is how good these phytochemicals are at synergizing existing cancer treatments like cisplatin, doxorubicin, all of those. It's fairly well studied. So again, I think that specialization is in order here. You have to pick a pretty particular path to be able to pursue it enough to understand what you need. What compounds do you need? What plant do you get them from? How do you refine them? And how do you get them to target that cancer? That's the primary problem. How, even though we know in the laboratory setting, in vitro, in vivo, it's still in the laboratory. Nearly all these studies are done either in a petri dish or with animals. In a petri dish it's hard to actually apply that to human beings in the real world, right? And then if you look at the animal studies, for instance, just the studies with mice, they come from very particular lines. These mice are genetically identical. Their environments are identical. The temperature is perfectly set. The entire course of the study, the food is identical. What fucking human culture is like that? Tell me one time you can get a group of humans together and say, this applies to all them, so this will work for them. And when you think about it in that sort of a perspective, this is why we need severely individualized treatment.
Yeah. So that's the whole thing. Yeah. Yep. Thanks for that.
And Vinod, I'd like to invite you back next term when we have Dr. Juliana Giles on, who specializes in Ayurvedic medicine, which, as you know, is Indian in its origin and predates Western medicine by thousands of years, but using beneficial herbs for a synergistic approach is that tradition. And so the question you ask is a great one, because cannabis alone might not get us there, right? Not in the same way that in the entourage effect, all the compounds from cannabis work better than individual ones. Several herbs working together can work better than just cannabis. So yeah.
So that's the drink that they drink in northern India called bhang,
Right.
That consists of almost like 19 to 20 Ayurvedic medicines, and just 4% of a normal indica strain in that. Just 4%. Rest of it is all what Russ said, fenugreek, peppers, chilies, and all these things. But they drink it every day and they're healthy every day, without any pain. So yeah, that's what we have to learn. Yeah.
And I think we're going to come more and more full circle back to traditions like your own or those of your country, where people realize, this is not a new conversation, certainly not a new plant, and we have a lot to learn from the people that came before us. So I expect that it's going to be a lot more common, these types of conversations in the future than they are right now.
Yeah, I'm happy to join the future conversation.
If I can touch on that just a little bit more, this is also a very critical part of the conversation. You're 100% right. This is old news, thousands of years old. My book can easily prove that, because this is what I learned as I went through 3,000 different studies. And so often the abstract was the same. We, the scientists, heard a lot of stuff about rosemary oil or whatever essential oil it is, because there's thousands that humans have been making. It always started the same. We heard a lot of stuff about humans making this essential oil from this plant for thousands of years. So we set out to say, what's the deal? Is it legit? And the conversation always was the same. Holy shit, with this study, we have confirmed that these thousands of years of use of these essential oils are 100% legitimized. And that's a really important part of the discussion, again, to bring back to individualized treatment, right? Maybe essential oils are the answer. I certainly know for myself that I always thought aromatherapy was bullshit. I thought it was a bunch of hippie nonsense until I researched this book and I was like, oh, damn, I owe that whole industry an apology, because it's extremely credible. It's well proven. There are studies that show it. Japanese forest bathing is a practice for a damn good reason. And so, yes, this holistic approach, Ayurvedic medicine is probably the right way to go. And most of the science has confirmed that.
And I think we got time for one more question. And Chuck, it's a good one here in the chat. Do terps contribute to the coffeeness of flower? I overheard a conversation in extraction lab regarding terpenes making concentrates coffee or initiating coughing from people. Have you ever heard that? I've not.
Have you ever noticed that some weed is more coffee than others? And is, I want to assign that to how it was grown or how it was up. But then I heard this conversation in a lab. Before you answer, Wendy, what brand of cannabis is showing the terps on their label so that we can provide them with revenue and give them our business? Didn't hear you, you're on mute, but come back to it. And my final question before I shut up and let Russ answer my first question, what's the best way for me to buy your book, direct from you or from Amazon?
Okay, direct from me is always the best. I try not to support those retailers at all. To be honest, I've never received a dime from any retail sale I've ever made. They keep all the money. So the second part, man, is, Chuck, I tend to agree with your thoughts that it's mainly about particulates, right? What are the particulates that are in that method of consumption? So whether you're vaping or whether you're smoking, and all those other things that you mentioned, like how it was grown, and just because a product, particularly flower, tests and pass at the laboratory, doesn't mean that it's something that you necessarily want to put into your lungs anyway, right? Like myself, after 30 years of smoking flower, I gave it up 2 months ago. I'll never go back for this exact reason.
What'd you switch to?
I've been trying like different vape pens and stuff, which never worked for me before until this time when I've quit flower. Now they do work, not well. I'm not happy with it, but I can't keep putting flower into my lungs. So I think, could there be a terpene that is causing irritation? Yeah, absolutely. If you go to PubChem and for any single terpene and you scroll to the bottom, which is where they have like toxicology reports, you'll see that when heated to a certain point, they'll produce toxic, irritating fumes. Some are worse than others. This is why I think the temperature discussion was a good place to start years ago. We seem to have slipped from that now. I don't hear a lot of people talking about vaping at particular temperatures anymore. We need to bring that back, and we need to keep that in mind. But also, in general, people, we shouldn't be putting shit in our lungs, right? That's not a cool thing for me to say as a longtime cannabis person. I'm just being honest. Whether you're vaping or whether you're smoking flower, and you're talking from a health standpoint, it's probably not good for you.
And that's a great point. We got so much to learn. We do get nerdy about temperature, so you'd be proud to know we're always talking about temperature and trying to keep it low so we can get the most benefit, the most flavor of those terpenes. And so also our lungs are not built for heated air. That's what our nostrils are supposed to do, is humidify and cool the air. And we're fighting against that if we go hot terps or hot dabs. I mean, hot vapes or hot dabs. Russ, thanks for being here today. We're really, really grateful. We know that we've only been able to dive into your book just a very little. So I would encourage those people who are interested to go to the website that's been listed here so they can find out how to buy your book for themselves. If you buy the book, please share it around, show other people, show your retailer that exists. Because very few retailers have resources out on the counter for people besides free magazines, right? So a responsible retailer will consider that. So grateful to have you today. Thank you. And thank you, Jackie, for helping make this happen as well. We want to
And
make
Trey,
sure.
can I say just one more thing?
Please.
The most important thing, if you want terpenes in your body, eat food, eat vegetables, eat fruits, a lot of them. Eat them a lot and all the time to build up those levels. You will never achieve therapeutic levels of terpenes with cannabis. End of story.
Thanks. And that's a great point. Like you started, terpenes surround us. They're part of nature, and that's the most direct way we can get them in our bodies. Unadulterated, right?
Right.
Raw. And so thank you for being here today, everybody. We do want to remind you, Nicole Lee will be on for Tuesday Night Student Lounge this week. The next week, on June 14th, we're going to have respiratory specialist Jessica Strufert, who's always preaching about temperature and our lung health. And then next month, for July Saturday Sesh, we're excited to announce that we're going to be welcoming Alvaro Wong and Antonio Havenar, who are the creators of the documentary Social Equity Up in Smoke, to talk about how the social equity efforts in LA just crashed and burned for a lot of people. It was a good effort, not well realized, and what's being done to try to remedy the additional harm that poor process caused. So thank you so much for spending your time with us today. My email is in there, so if anybody wants to reach out to me, it's in the chat. But thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see you back either for Tuesday Night Student Lounge or next month for Saturday Sesh. You can find this chat on YouTube in just a few days. Thanks, everybody. Have a good Saturday.